Hi, I'm Kyle Swicegood with the Rotary Club of Moxville, and we're continuing our conversation with World War II veterans. And I'm here with Don Wooten, who is also a member of the Rotary Club of Moxville. And this is just a few days before we're going to be heading to Washington, D.C. with about 150 World War II veterans. I'm excited today to have a World War II veteran, Aubry Gray, who, as I call it, is not only a World War II veteran, but he is a Pearl Harbor survivor. Aubry, how are you?
I'm fine.
Good. Speak up. You're going to have to speak up a little bit.
Well, I'll try.
There you go. Aubry, what I want to do, first of all, where are you from?
Well, I was born in a little place called Beattyville, Kentucky, in Lee County. It's where the three streams come together that form the Kentucky River.
Mm-hmm.
It's in what you would pretty much in the middle of Kentucky.
Right.
Moved to North Carolina. Oh, man. I was too young to remember it. I don't know just what year it was. Lived in Arizona then for 3 years and came back to North Carolina. And pretty much lived in North Carolina ever since that time.
So, what year did you go into the military?
I went in 1940.
So you were on the front side of World War II. Where did you go to basic training?
Norfolk. I went in the Navy at that time because I knew I was prime grade for being drafted into the Army. I didn't want to be in the Army, so I took the Navy instead. So a lot of people would get mad at me for saying that, but basically that's why I went in the Navy.
Well, that's the fact.
I didn't want to be in the Army.
So when you entered the military, you went to the Navy, you went to Norfolk, and did you leave from Norfolk and go straight to Pearl Harbor?
More or less. I went on board ship to Cuba and Puerto Rico, through the Panama Canal, all the way up to San Francisco when they told me I should have been put off the ship in Los Angeles, but they goofed because I didn't know it. So I went back to Los Angeles and then went to Hawaii and Pearl Harbor.
So you went from Los Angeles on a boat to Pearl Harbor?
Well, a ship.
Right. Well, I'm not Navy, so there you have it. You know,
But I went
if I were Navy, I would call it a
I
ship.
went back to L.A. from there before I went to Hawaii, though.
So when you got off that boat in Hawaii, you thought the military was for you, I bet, as beautiful as that place is.
I liked it there. It didn't take me long to meet people and get acquainted with a few. Too many to get acquainted with all of them, but it wasn't long. And I take after my dad in that respect. He'd talk to anyone, even if he'd never seen them before or heard of them. And I took that trait after him. And I can sit down and talk to a stranger anytime, and we can find something to talk about.
How old were you at that time?
20.
20 years old. So what month, do you remember what month you landed on Pearl Harbor?
No, I don't. I could probably maybe found some papers if I'd have known you were going to ask
Well,
that
that's
question.
okay. How long were you there before the day that will last in infamy, December 7th?
I was probably there close to 6 months. And it was a great place for a sailor to be stationed at that time. But unfortunately, Mizuho and his comrades and
Now, who was that again?
Mizuho.
You know how to pronounce that like you're native.
I met him.
Okay, let's talk about that. Who is that?
He is the pilot that led the air attack on Pearl Harbor.
And you met him?
I met him after the war was over.
How did you happen upon him?
Well, I happened to hear that he was in California, and so was I, and I made it a point to be sure I did meet him.
Were you wanting to give him a piece of your mind?
No.
Or what were you wanting to do?
I wanted to meet the man and talk to him. Just it's simple as that. I guess I have a slightly different attitude. A lot of people would have been very mad, angry, upset. But he did his job. That's what he was supposed to do. And if I'd have had a gun and could have got it aimed at him, I'd have shot him too, because that's what I should have done.
In 41.
But the opportunity wasn't there for me. But some of his gunners did a pretty good job. Couldn't get my hands on a gun fast enough, so I started carrying ammunition. And I got caught in the open by one of the Jap planes, and the gunner in the plane started firing at me. I could hear the rounds going by my head, and I heard a little thunk and looked down. There's a mark in the concrete 2 inches from my right foot.
So were you on like a tarmac? I mean.
Yeah, I was stationed with Utility Squadron 2 on Ford Island, which is in the middle of, more or less, of Pearl Harbor.
Well, let's back up. On that day, December the 7th, you woke up. Probably what time?
Well, since I was in the duty section that day, it was probably around 6 o'clock.
Okay.
Because it started your duties on a weekend like that. Usually you change shifts about 7 o'clock. And I was expected to be there for at least 6 hours out of that day, and then I'd be off the rest of the day. Didn't work out that way, but that would have been normal procedure.
So when did you know that that day was going to be a day that would change the world?
Well, heard the planes diving, motors revving up from the Japanese aircraft, and like a lot of the others in my unit, we were lined up in the hangar for morning muster, roll call to those that don't know what we mean by muster in the Navy. And we all broke ranks and went outside to see what the heck was going on. And when the plane went over about 30 feet over my head and the rear gunner started shooting at me, I knew what was going on. And I could see the plane quite clearly, see the markings on it. And if he hadn't had goggles pulled down over his eyes, I could have seen his face good enough to recognize him. He was that close. But he missed me. I could hear him going by my head, and I heard a thunk and looked down, and there's a mark 2 inches from my right foot where one round had hit. He came that close to at least doing a little damage to me. I haven't forgiven him for that yet, because I didn't have anything to shoot back with at that point in time.
Did you get a chance?
No.
Can we go back to the pilot that you were talking about? I can't pronounce the name.
Mizuho Fuchida?
Yes. You told us your attitude regarding him, your respect for him. What was his toward you when you met?
Well, we met pretty much as any two strangers would. We had the fact that we had been at the same place, or very much so, at a time in the past, even though we didn't know each other. But it was about 10 years after the end of World War II, when he was on a speaking tour on the West Coast, and I happened to be on the West Coast, and I made an appointment to get an appointment and go out of my way, and I sat down across the table from him and had a meal with him. And I do not regret any part of it.
Commend you for it.
And we sat there and we talked and we discussed things and how they were.
I've seen a couple of documentaries from the Japanese point of view, and some of them have felt the same way that you did in terms of respecting the American soldier, airman, Navy, so whatever, in terms of it. They looked at it as they were just doing their job in that war, just like the Japanese counterpart was. It was just interesting that they were basically sounding just like you did just a few minutes ago.
Well, that guy that was shooting at me and got so close, if I'd have had a gun in my hands, I'd have been shooting back, but unfortunately, I did not.
Did you ever get a chance to fire back?
No, I did not during that attack.
So,
but I hauled a whole bunch of ammunition to those that had the guns.
Okay, so that was your part. You were.
Oh, I was in the open quite a bit of the time while I was carrying ammunition. And those boxes weighed over 100 pounds. It was not for the weak and.
Well, let me ask a
tough.
silly question. Were you scared?
At that time, no. I was just too mad to be scared. I would just call it mad, call it angry, whatever suits you. It doesn't matter. All I wanted to do was get even with those. Well, I can't say that. You might want to repeat it sometime.
I bet you were just focused on shooting them out of the sky as quickly as you could.
Well, if I couldn't get my hands on a gun to shoot, at least I could carry ammunition to those that had the guns, and that's what I did.
Did you lose any friends?
Strangely, no.
Mm-hmm.
How and why, I don't have an answer for.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. When you can hear those bullets going by your ear and you know how close they are, and hitting 2 inches from your foot and leaving a mark there, you know they're close.
When you look at how many, at the thousands that died that day, it is remarkable.
Well, I don't try to be theatrical about it, but a lot of people have tried to pin me down on some of that, and I say, well, thank the man upstairs. It just wasn't my time to go.
That's a common thread so far in our conversations today, is that the soldiers that we are speaking with all continue to talk about the faith that they had and about how they felt like God was watching out for them.
I absolutely believe that, and the peculiar part of my whole Navy career, that was the first and the last encounter I ever had with the enemy while I was in the Navy. I spent the rest of my time taking care of machine guns, both electric and hydraulic gun turrets on planes, working with both 30 and 50 caliber machine guns, Thompson submachine guns, everything that if it would fire a projectile at some point, I had something to do with it. Maintenance or repair, or one time I was even teaching some of these young kids how to shoot them.
Mm-hmm.
That scared me more than anything.
Did you spend all of your tour at Pearl Harbor?
I was there until about, I don't remember the dates. It was either late 43, very late, or possibly early in 44. I leaned toward the 44. And I got back into actually Seattle on the aircraft carrier. I think it was the old Enterprise, if I recall correctly. And they sent me over to Sandpoint Naval Air Station. And they looked at me and said, you're up for at least 30 days leave. Said, pack your bags and get the hell out of here. I did. So that's basically the way it went. And came home to North Carolina. Of course, I was welcomed back by my family.
Did you fly or come by train?
On that trip, I came by train. I couldn't get a flight. Commercial airlines, there's no way I could have got a flight. And I couldn't find any military planes that were coming, so I said, well, if the trains are still running, away we go. That's what I did.
When you were at Ford Island, you were there during the assault. Did you, when the assault was over, how many hours did that last?
That's a question I cannot give you a really good answer on, because time was not what we were worrying about.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, at a wild guess, probably not more than 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I might be off on that by who knows. I don't know.
Did you make your way from Ford Island down to the Battleship Row?
No, not at that time.
Mm-hmm. That day, or
No, it was weeks later. Shortly after that, I was transferred to the Naval Air Station at Pune, Maui, which is the second largest of the Hawaiian group. And given my background and the schools I had attended, I couldn't get away from there because they didn't have anybody to take my place. It's not that I was all that good, but you got to have somebody that kind of knows what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I got there and was stuck. Old Navy captain, full captain, he would have been retired, John L. Murphy. He's a nice guy in a lot of ways, but I don't know who built up my reputation, but he had a 32 Colt. I think it belonged to a lady friend of his, I don't know for sure. Semi-automatic pistol, and he'd send it down ever so often, but one of the yeomen in the office of the air station office for Gray to look at it and clean it and bring it back. Said if Gray isn't there, don't leave it. Bring it back anyway. So I don't know who built up my reputation, but I didn't try to kill it.
That was a good man to be in, to have your favor, right?
It was in my favor, and I didn't want to change it. I don't pull any punches on that. I know what it was, because I was one of those young people that really went upgraded in the Navy at a far faster rate than would ever have been done in peace times. I would not have got those promotions.
And what did you
peacetime.
leave the military? What was your ranking when you left the military?
Aviation Chief Ordnance Man.
Okay.
Or Aviation Ordnance Chief, depending on who you talk to.
Right. Now, were you married at this time?
At the time I was there in Maui and Pearl Harbor, no.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know the young lady till 1944.
So where did you meet your future bride?
Winston-Salem. I got home on leave in, well, it was a little past middle of 1944, and I got 30 days leave. Had to ride a train all the way into Winston-Salem.
Which took how long? Which took how long?
If I recall right, I'm going to say about 5.5 days. I may be off a half day or so, I'm not sure. That may have been 6 instead of 5.5.
Okay.
But my sister was employed at the old National Carbon Company in Winston-Salem, where they made some parts for bomb fuses. And she didn't really know what she was making anyway. They wouldn't even tell the people that worked on them. So I never did get a clear story, and I got home and leave. I didn't know anyone anymore. I asked her if she knew any nice young ladies I could get a date with. So she arranged a blind date for the young lady I got engaged to and married.
And how quickly after you met her were you engaged and married?
We were engaged within 30 days, and we were married within 6 months.
And your wife is deceased now.
Mm-hmm.
What was her name?
Maiden name was Kathleen Whitley.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it was the first name went ahead of that, but she despised it and wouldn't use it, so I won't divulge that one.
And you were married for how long?
Oh, good grief. We had our 50th anniversary about a month and a half or so, and I'm guessing partly, before she passed away. And that's as close as I can pin it down now without going back and digging through some ancient papers to try to find it, which I may or may not find anyway.
And I would say, correctly, tell me that you were an in-love man for 50 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have traded her for anything I know.
That's great. That's great. Do you feel like we did the right thing by dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Today, I will still applaud that decision. I don't know. I know it killed a lot of Japanese. And I look back and think how many Americans lived because of it. Therefore, I do not really regret it. If anything, I'm somewhat put back that it was necessary to do that. But the way things were going and the way things worked out, I say, good. It was something that actually I'm still feel like it probably saved more lives than it took.
Mm-hmm.
Because it ended the war. And there's no way to know how many lives might have been lost if that war had not ended when it did. So from my standpoint, I have no regrets about it. I think it was the right thing to do. We had it. We should use it.
Mm-hmm. We've got about 4 minutes left of our interview. And Don, I want to ask you if you've got any specific questions regarding Aubry's experience in Pearl Harbor or other that you'd like to ask him while we have him here in front of the camera?
No, not at this time.
Very
Well,
good.
let me add one little fact that might surprise most people. I have more time in the air, not to be a pilot, than I ever spent aboard a Navy ship while I was in the Navy.
So you weren't on a ship very much?
I was never on a ship as a part of the ship's crew. When I was on a ship, I was going from point A to B or C or wherever. I was strictly more or less in the passenger status. Of course, that didn't keep them from finding something to keep you busy. But no, I was kind of glad in the way things worked out that they did. I got a good taste of what it was like on board a ship, and it made me realize how well off I had been being with the aviation part of the Navy. And I tell people, and quite truthfully, I have more time in the air than I ever spent on board a ship, because a lot of days I spent 8 hours a day in the air, and you'd never know why. We were towing targets. We had a reel inside the plane and went down through the bottom hatch and pulley there, wheel, and the steel cable came up. You put what they call a dead man sometimes, and other things other times, and it had a trip feature on it, and you put a string of rings about so big around that and pushed them up, and you tied them. They had about a 5-foot rope lead on them, and you tied them inside the plane so they didn't go flying out down that cable while you were towing a target. But then if they shot the cable in two, you could pull it in, put another dead man on the end of it that would release and also hold the next target you streamed out. And that way we always came in with a very small little chute on one of the lanyards in the ring that was the last to go out. That way we could reel in virtually all of that cable, which would have been a huge hazard to try to land an aircraft with that maybe 8,000 or 10,000 feet behind you.
Were the targets for ship target practice or for planes?
It depended on where you were and what kind of plane you were using. Now, out of Pearl Harbor, they used the old PBY Catalinas, and they flew at an altitude of about 10,000 feet with that many feet of cable strung out behind them. But I was flying in the old, it was a biplane Grumman. What did they call that thing? I think they called it the Duck, for lack of a better term. It was amphibious. Underneath the fuselage was a section with a built-in float. It was not removable. It was a permanent part of the aircraft. But it did have retractable wheels, so it could land on a landing strip, or it could land on water. But one thing that always bothered most of the pilots that flew those planes, you couldn't get it off of rough water. It just wouldn't do. It'd hit the waves and it'd slow it up so much you couldn't get up speed to fly. So they had to have reasonably decent and calm water to take off from water. But they were a workhorse type of plane. They were just used for anything that came along that ordinary fighter planes and such as that couldn't do. But that plane would do it.
Well, Aubry, we've got just a few minutes left, so I want to ask you the same question that I asked another veteran. And the purpose of these videos is to be left here in the Davie County Public Library so that people in the future, after you're gone, after I'm gone, can go back and see and hear firsthand from somebody who was there. What would you want to tell someone 20 years from now in this video about your experience in World War II and about our country?
Well, I think our country didn't have any choice but to do what had to be done. And I give them full credit, our leaders at that time, members of Congress, the President, all of them. Because if people don't realize that if that war hadn't been fought, the entire western portion of this country would be speaking Japanese now, and we'd be here in the eastern part would probably have been speaking German. We had to win that war. And I think back and I realize what the consequences of losing would have meant. this country would no longer have been habitable by people like you and I. We're too independent. We wouldn't have survived. But the only thing I know is I hope I never had to do it again. But if it boiled down to that, I'd go and do what I could. I can still aim a gun. I can't walk very far. I can't run. But I can still drive a vehicle, and I can still shoot a machine gun.
Well, that's another resounding comment that we've heard from other veterans. Well, Aubry, Don and I, and on behalf of the Rotary Club of Moxville, want to thank you, number one, for your service to our country. We're thankful for what you accomplished and what you did in protecting our nation at Pearl Harbor. Thank you for coming today, and we look forward to flying to Washington, D.C. Saturday morning to see the memorial that memorializes what you and the brothers and sisters you have in World War II did to protect our country.
There is a gentleman here in Davie County. I have to go to a shopping mall over here right at the river. I forget which side it's on now. But he's going to meet me there. My neighbor's going to drive me over there. And I'll ride with him then on to Greensboro. Mm-hmm. And when that flight to Washington is over, we'll come back, of course, to Greensboro, and he's going to bring me back home. Mm-hmm. So that part of it is arranged.
It's taken
if it wasn't for that, I couldn't go.
Well, you're going to be taken
My
care of.
My ability to walk is very limited anymore. Mm-hmm. This, from here to here, and this knee is all metal. Mm-hmm. And so far, all I've had to do at any place that had a metal detector was tell them the story and say, I've got a total knee replacement, all metal. Mm-hmm. And I've also got a programmable pacemaker, and if you put that handheld metal detector up there, you're going to ruin my pacemaker. Well, it might ruin me in the process.
Well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. So
it's not something to play around with.
That's exactly right. So Aubry, thank you. That is our interview with Aubry Gray, a Navy veteran from World War II who served our nation at Pearl Harbor. Be proud to be an American.